What if the most terrifying experiments in human history never happened in laboratories, but inside prison walls? What if governments used inmates as human guinea pigs to test technologies so dangerous that no volunteer would ever agree? We're talking about time travel, actual documented cases of prisoners who vanished from their cells, reappeared decades older, or came back with memories of futures that haven't happened yet. These are 10 time travel experiments conducted on prisoners, and they will disturb you. Number 10. The vanishing inmate of Alcatraz. This case is so disturbing that even the guards who witnessed it refused to speak about it for decades. Imagine you're a death row inmate in 1958, locked inside the most infamous prison in America. You have nothing left, no hope, no future, no reason to say no when mysterious men in suits offer you a chance to participate in a medical experiment. They promise that if you survive, your sentence will be commuted. You have absolutely nothing to lose. So, you agree? And that decision changes everything. Marcus Hale was a convicted murderer awaiting execution at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. He had killed 2 men during a robbery gone wrong, and the state of California was going to make him pay with his life. But in the winter of 1958, Hale was approached by government officials who gave him an unusual offer: participate in a classified research program, and if he survived, he would spend the rest of his life in prison instead of dying in the electric chair. Hale signed the paperwork that same day. What happened next was documented by 3 prison guards who were present during the experiment. Hale was taken to an underground facility that existed beneath Alcatraz itself, a complex that officially does not appear on any architectural plans of the prison. There, he was placed inside a cylindrical chamber surrounded by massive electromagnetic coils. Researchers injected him with an unknown compound and activated the machine. During the 3rd session, something went horribly wrong. The guards reported that Hale began convulsing violently. A blinding flash of light filled the room. And then, according to all 3 witnesses, Marcus Hale folded into himself and vanished. One guard described it as watching a man crumple like paper being crushed by an invisible hand. The cell remained locked from the inside. There was no escape route, no hidden passage, no logical explanation. Marcus Hale was simply gone. The prison conducted a secret investigation but found nothing. No body, no evidence, no trace of what had happened. The experiment was classified at the highest level, and all records were supposedly destroyed in a fire in 1962. For 45 years, the case remained buried, and then something truly impossible happened. In 2003, a homeless man was found wandering the streets of San Francisco in a state of complete confusion. He was wearing what appeared to be a vintage 1950s prison uniform, and he kept insisting that the year was 1958. He introduced himself as Marcus Hale. Police initially assumed he was mentally ill, but when they ran his fingerprints through the national database, they got a match that made absolutely no sense. The prints were identical to those of Marcus Hale, the Alcatraz inmate who had vanished 45 years earlier. Not similar, identical. The same scars, the same ridge patterns, the same man. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The man appeared to be roughly the same age as Hale was in 1958, somewhere in his mid-30s. He had not aged a single day. For the rest of the world, nearly half a century had passed. For him, it seemed like mere minutes. He kept asking about President Eisenhower and seemed genuinely terrified by modern cars and technology. Doctors who examined him found nothing physically wrong, at least not initially. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale was dead. His body began deteriorating at an impossible rate. Doctors described his organs as aging decades within days, as if his cells were catching up to the time he had missed. One physician who examined him said it was like watching a man decompose while still alive. His final words, whispered to a nurse just hours before he died, were chilling. He said, "I was nowhere. There was nothing. Just darkness and the sound of my own heartbeat for what felt like forever." If Marcus Hale truly spent 45 years somewhere between 1958 and 2003, where was he? Was he trapped in some kind of void outside of time itself? And why did his body begin destroying itself the moment he returned to the normal flow of time? Some researchers believe that Alcatraz was built on a site of unusual magnetic activity, a location where the fabric of space-time is thinner than anywhere else. Perhaps the experiment accidentally opened a door that was never meant to be opened, and Marcus Hale paid the price. Number 9, the Siberian loop prisoners. What you're about to hear is one of the most horrifying time experiments ever conducted, and the Soviet government went to extraordinary lengths to ensure it stayed buried forever. Imagine being locked inside an underground bunker for what you're told will be 3 days. You fall asleep, you wake up, you eat your rations, you wait. But when the doors finally open, you've aged 17 years, your hair has turned gray, your body is broken, and you have memories of nearly 2 decades that the outside world insists never happened. That is exactly what 12 Soviet prisoners claimed they experienced in 1961. The experiment took place at a remote facility in Siberia, buried deep beneath the frozen earth, where no one could hear what happened inside. The program was codenamed Kronos Gate, and its purpose was to test whether time itself could be manipulated using electromagnetic fields and experimental radiation. The Soviet government needed test subjects who wouldn't be missed. People with no families, no connections, no one who would ask questions. They found exactly what they needed in the Gulag system. 12 violent offenders were selected and transported to the facility in complete secrecy. None of them knew what they had volunteered for. They were simply told they would spend 72 hours in an underground observation chamber as part of a medical study. The bunker was equipped with rotating magnetic rings built into the walls and ceiling. Experimental radiation emitters lined every surface, filling the room with a low, constant hum. The prisoners were given enough food and water for exactly 3 days. Then, the massive steel doors sealed shut behind them, and they were left alone in the dim, artificial light. 72 hours later, the doors opened again. But the men who stumbled out were not the same men who had walked in. The guards reported that the prisoners looked like they had aged decades. Their beards were long and matted. Their bodies were thin and frail. Several had gray hair, and 2 of the 12 were missing entirely. The survivors were hysterical, weeping, clinging to the guards, and begging to know what year it was. When they were told it was still 1961 and that only 3 days had passed, they refused to believe it. Every single one of them insisted they had been trapped inside that bunker for 17 years. Medical examinations confirmed the impossible. The prisoners showed biological aging of 15 to 20 years. Their bones had deteriorated. Their organs showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. One man had developed cataracts that typically take decades to form. Yet the bunker contained only 72 hours worth of consumed supplies. The food was gone, the water was gone, but nothing else suggested that 17 years had passed inside those walls. The survivors described their experience in disturbing detail. They spoke of forming relationships, of fighting over rations, of watching 2 of their fellow prisoners die of starvation in what they believed was the 3rd year. They described hearing strange sounds through the walls, radio broadcasts that seemed to come from the future. One man claimed he heard news reports about a nuclear disaster at a place called Chernobyl. Another described hearing an announcement about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Events that wouldn't occur for decades, described with chilling accuracy by men who had supposedly experienced only 3 days. 8 of the 10 survivors died within 2 years of the experiment. Doctors attributed their deaths to something they called temporal displacement syndrome, a complete breakdown of the body's biological rhythms. The remaining 4 were committed to psychiatric facilities where they spent the rest of their lives, but one of them, interviewed secretly in 1989, made a prediction that stunned the researchers who heard it. He described in precise detail the events of the 1991 Soviet coup, including specific names and dates, 2 years before it happened. He died 3 months before his prediction came true. Those 12 prisoners didn't travel to the future. Something far stranger happened. The future came to them, compressed and accelerated into an impossible pocket of distorted time. They lived 17 years, while the world outside experienced 3 days. And the things they heard through those bunker walls suggest they somehow tuned into a timeline that hadn't happened yet. How is something like that even possible? And if time can be bent like that, what else might be happening in facilities we don't even know exist? Number 8. The Juvenile Temporal Displacement Program. This case is deeply disturbing because it didn't involve hardened criminals or death row inmates. It involved children. Imagine you're 14 years old, locked away in a government facility for stealing food. You have no parents, no one who cares whether you live or die. And one day, men in white coats tell you they want to try something. They say it won't hurt. They say you'll be helping your country. You're just a kid, so you believe them. And then they send you 3 days into the future, a future that shows you something so terrible, you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you had never seen it. In 1967, a classified juvenile detention center in the Nevada desert became the site of one of the most controversial experiments in American history. The program was codenamed Tomorrow's Children, and its hypothesis was as brilliant as it was horrifying. Government researchers believed that younger minds were more adaptable to temporal displacement, that the neural plasticity of adolescent brains would allow them to survive journeys through time that would destroy adult subjects. They needed test subjects with no families, no advocates, no one who would notice if something went wrong. They found them in the juvenile detention system. Danny Weaver was 14 years old when he became the program's primary test subject. He had been incarcerated for stealing food from a grocery store, a desperate act by a desperate boy with nowhere else to turn. He had no parents, no relatives, no one who would come looking for him. To the researchers, he was perfect. Danny was told he would be participating in a special medical study that would help scientists understand how the human brain works. He wasn't told he would be sent through time. The experiment began on April 1st, 1968. Danny was placed inside a sensory deprivation tank filled with a warm saline solution. Researchers fitted an electromagnetic helmet over his head, covering his eyes and ears completely. The machine hummed to life, and for Danny, everything went dark. When consciousness returned, he was still floating in the tank, but something felt different. The water was colder, the hum of the machine was gone, and when technicians finally pulled him out, he was screaming. Danny insisted that he had experienced 3 full days inside that tank. He described climbing out into the same room, but finding everything subtly changed. Different guards stood at the doors, different newspapers sat on the tables. He remembered reading headlines, listening to conversations, watching television broadcasts in a recreation room that looked almost identical to the one he knew, but wasn't quite right. Most of all, he remembered a newspaper headline that burned itself into his memory. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. Danny described the date, the location, the chaos that followed. He provided specific details about the weather, about sports scores, about phrases spoken by newscasters. The researchers listened with growing unease. The date of the experiment was April 1st, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. Exactly 3 days later, Danny Weaver had seen the future, and everything he described came true with disturbing precision. The weather matched, the sports scores matched. The specific phrases he quoted appeared word for word on national broadcasts 3 days after he spoke them. The implications were staggering. A 14-year-old boy had somehow witnessed events that hadn't happened yet. The program was immediately classified at the highest level. Danny Weaver was transferred to an unknown facility, and all records of his existence were sealed. For 3 decades, the case remained completely buried. But in 1998, a researcher who had worked on the original program came forward with a shocking claim. He said he had encountered an elderly man in Arizona who identified himself as Danny Weaver. The man would have been only 45 years old, but he appeared to be in his 80s, frail and withered, his body aged far beyond its years. Danny Weaver saw 3 days into the future when he was just a child, but the cost of that vision seems to have been decades of his own life. Whatever the Tomorrow's Children program did to that boy, it took something from him that he could never get back. They used a child to peek through the curtain of time. And time, it seems, doesn't forgive those who look where they're not supposed to. Number 7. The retrograde prisoner of Montalk. This case will make you question everything you think you know about cause and effect, about past and present, about the very nature of time itself. Imagine volunteering for a mission that sends you backward through time. You're told to observe, to gather data, to return safely with information that could change the course of human history. But something goes wrong. The portal collapses, and instead of coming home, you find yourself trapped in the past, decades before you were even born, with no way back and no one who believes your impossible story. That is allegedly what happened to a convicted spy named Victor Drennan in 1983. The Montalk project remains one of the most controversial and mysterious government programs ever rumored to exist. Officially, Montalk Air Force Station on Long Island was decommissioned in 1981. Unofficially, researchers claim that experiments continued in underground facilities, experiments that pushed the boundaries of physics, consciousness, and time itself. The project was said to be an extension of the Philadelphia experiment from 1943, an attempt to finally master the technology that had caused such catastrophic results 4 decades earlier. And they needed someone expendable to test it. Victor Drennan was a former intelligence officer convicted of selling classified information to foreign governments. He was facing a life sentence with no possibility of parole, rotting away in a military prison with nothing but decades of concrete walls ahead of him. When government officials approached him with an offer, he didn't hesitate. They told him about a device called the Montalk chair, a machine allegedly capable of opening portals through time using psychic amplification. They wanted to send someone back to 1943 to observe the original Philadelphia experiment from a safe distance. If Drennan succeeded, he would earn his freedom. If he failed, well, he was already serving life anyway. On a cold night in November 1983, Victor Drennan sat down in the Montalk chair. Electrodes were attached to his temples. The massive machine hummed to life, filling the underground chamber with an otherworldly vibration. Researchers monitored screens filled with data they barely understood. For a few moments, everything seemed to be working. A shimmering portal opened in front of the chair, showing glimpses of a harbor, warships, a world from 40 years in the past. And then something went catastrophically wrong. The portal flickered, destabilized, and collapsed with a thunderous crack. When the light faded, the chair was empty. Victor Drennan was gone, and he never returned. For decades, his disappearance remained an unsolved mystery within classified circles. But in 2007, a researcher examining recently declassified photographs from the Philadelphia experiment noticed something that made his blood run cold. In a photograph of the USS Eldridge crew taken in October 1943, there was an anomaly. Standing in the background, partially obscured by other sailors, was a man who didn't belong. He was wearing glasses with a distinctly modern style. On his wrist, barely visible, was what appeared to be a digital watch, technology that wouldn't exist for another 30 years. Facial recognition software analyzed the image and returned a result that defied all logic. The face was a 94% match to Victor Drennan's 1983 prison photograph. If this analysis is accurate, then Victor Drennan didn't just travel back to 1943. He arrived during the exact moment the Philadelphia experiment went wrong, the moment when sailors were allegedly fused into the metal of the ship, when reality itself seemed to tear apart. Witnesses from that night in 1943 described chaos and horror. They spoke of men screaming, men appearing and disappearing, men trapped halfway inside solid steel. And one witness, interviewed years later, mentioned something strange. He recalled hearing a man shouting a word that made no sense to anyone at the time. The word was Reagan. Victor Drennan volunteered to observe history from a safe distance. Instead, he appears to have been pulled directly into the heart of a disaster that happened 4 decades before his birth. He may have died there, fused into the bulkheads like the other victims. Or perhaps he lived, stranded in a past where no one would ever believe his story. Either way, he never came home. Retrograde time travel may be possible, but the evidence suggests it could be a one-way trip. You can go back, but you might never find your way forward again. Number 6. The temporal contamination subject. This case is unlike anything we've covered so far because it isn't just about traveling through time. It's about what you might bring back with you. Imagine being sent 200 years into the future. You're only gone for a few seconds in real time, but what you experience on the other side changes you forever. And when you return, you're carrying something inside your body, something invisible, something that begins spreading to everyone around you. Within weeks, people start dying from a disease that doesn't exist yet. That is exactly what allegedly happened to a British prisoner named Arthur Blackwell in 1971. The experiment took place in a classified facility, buried deep beneath Dartmoor Prison in England. The program was codenamed Eon Gate, and it represented the most ambitious temporal displacement attempt ever conducted by British intelligence. Previous experiments had sent subjects forward by hours or days. This time, researchers wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible. They wanted to send someone 200 years into the future, to the year 2171, and they needed a test subject who wouldn't be missed if something went terribly wrong. Arthur Blackwell was serving 20 years for armed robbery. He had no family, no connections, no one who would ask questions if he simply disappeared. When officials offered him a chance at early release in exchange for participation in a classified medical study, he agreed without hesitation. He had no idea what he was actually volunteering for. He had no idea that within a month he would be dead, along with everyone who had touched him. The experiment lasted exactly 3.7 seconds in real time. Blackwell stepped into the displacement chamber, a cylindrical room surrounded by massive electromagnetic coils and humming with energy that made his teeth vibrate. Researchers activated the sequence, and Blackwell vanished in a flash of blinding white light. When he reappeared less than 4 seconds later, he was screaming. His body was covered in a strange iridescent residue that shimmered like oil on water. His eyes were wide with terror, and he couldn't stop shaking. In the debriefing that followed, Blackwell described a world that sounded like a nightmare. He said he had been gone for at least a week, though only seconds had passed in the present. He spoke of glass towers stretching into red skies, of cities built underground, of people who wore masks constantly and never exposed their skin to sunlight. He described an Earth that had been transformed by some kind of catastrophe, a world where the very air was different, where survival required adaptation that modern humans couldn't comprehend. The researchers listened with fascination, but they didn't yet understand the danger. Within 48 hours, Arthur Blackwell began showing symptoms that no doctor could explain. His skin became translucent, so thin that his internal organs were visible beneath the surface. His eyes clouded over with a milky film. He complained of hearing sounds that no one else could hear, frequencies that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the researchers who had handled him during the experiment began showing the same symptoms. Within 2 weeks, 4 scientists and 2 prison guards had developed identical conditions. The iridescent residue had spread to all of them through simple physical contact. All affected individuals were immediately quarantined in the underground facility. Blackwell died after 23 days of deteriorating agony. His autopsy revealed something that terrified the medical team. His cells were mutating in ways that corresponded to no known pathogen, no known disease, no known biological process. It was as if his body was trying to become something else entirely. The other victims followed over the next several months, each one dying as their bodies underwent the same impossible transformation. The British government officially attributed the deaths to a chemical accident and sealed the facility permanently. But in 1989, a former researcher broke his silence and offered a theory that haunts everyone who hears it. He believed that what killed Arthur Blackwell wasn't a disease at all. It was evolution. The residue Blackwell brought back was biological material from humans who had adapted to survive on a future Earth. And when it entered present-day human bodies, it tried to force that same adaptation, a process our primitive biology simply couldn't survive. Arthur Blackwell didn't bring back an illness. He brought back evidence that humanity will change into something we might not even recognize. Number 5, the consciousness swap experiment. This case is absolutely mind-bending because it suggests that time travel might not just move your body through the years. It might move your mind into an entirely different version of reality. Imagine waking up one day with memories that aren't yours, speaking a language you never learned, knowing things about a world that doesn't exist. Imagine looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger's face staring back at you, while somewhere deep inside, the real you is screaming to get out. That is allegedly what happened to a Mexican prisoner named Raul Esperanza in 1979, a man who came back from a parallel timeline with someone else living inside his head. The experiment took place in an underground facility near Mexico City, part of a joint US-Mexican program codenamed Puerta del Tiempo, which translates to Door of Time. The program was based on a radical theory that had been circulating in classified scientific circles for years. Researchers believed that parallel timelines existed alongside our own, alternate versions of reality where history had unfolded differently. They theorized that these timelines could be accessed not through physical travel, but through consciousness displacement, projecting a person's mind across the dimensional barrier while their body remained behind. They needed a test subject whose disappearance wouldn't raise questions. They found Raul Esperanza. Raul was a young man convicted of murder, though he had always maintained his innocence. He had no family willing to claim him, no lawyer willing to fight for him, no one who would notice if he vanished from his cell one night. He was brought to the facility blindfolded and told only that he would be participating in an experiment that could prove his mind was different from other criminals. He wasn't told that researchers would be attempting to push his consciousness into another dimension entirely. The procedure involved exposing Raul's brain to a specific frequency of radiation designed to stimulate the pineal gland, a small structure deep within the brain that some researchers believed served as a gateway between dimensions. Raul was strapped to a table, electrodes attached to his skull, and the machine was activated. For exactly 4 minutes, his body lay motionless, his vital signs barely registering. When he finally opened his eyes, the researchers knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. Raul began speaking in Russian, not broken phrases or scattered words, but fluent, rapid, panicked Russian with a native accent. He thrashed against his restraints, screaming that he didn't belong here, that this wasn't his body, that someone needed to send him back. When a translator was finally brought in, the man claiming to inhabit Raul's body identified himself as Dmitry Volkov, a Soviet physicist from what he called the other side. He provided detailed technical information about the Soviet nuclear program, information that was later verified as accurate by American intelligence. But he also described a world that didn't match our history at all. According to Dmitry, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 had escalated into full nuclear war. He described American cities reduced to rubble, Soviet occupation of Western Europe, decades of conflict that had reshaped the entire planet. He spoke of events from his timeline up to 1979 with perfect clarity, a history completely different from our own. But the most disturbing moments came when the original Raul's personality would suddenly resurface. His voice would change, his eyes would fill with confusion and terror, and he would beg the researchers to explain what was happening to him. Then, just as quickly, Dmitry would return, frustrated and desperate to find a way home. The two personalities coexisted in constant conflict for 3 years. Raul would surface for hours or days at a time, weeping, disoriented, unable to understand why he sometimes lost control of his own body. Dmitry would emerge with cold precision, demanding that the researchers reverse the experiment, insisting that his real body was trapped in a Mexican prison cell in another reality. In 1982, the vessel they shared could no longer sustain the strain. Raul Esperanza died of a massive brain hemorrhage. The autopsy revealed something unprecedented. 2 distinct neural patterns had developed within a single brain, as if 2 separate minds had been fighting for control of one body. When Raul came back from that other timeline, he wasn't alone. And somewhere across the dimensional barrier, Dmitry Volkov is perhaps still wondering why he suddenly woke up in a stranger's skin. Number 4, the bidirectional prisoner. This case breaks every rule of logic and physics that we think we understand. Imagine living your entire life, building a family, growing old, and then one day walking into a funeral home and seeing your own face lying in the casket. Not someone who looks like you. You. The same scars, the same birthmarks, the same hands you've looked at every day for decades. That is exactly what allegedly happened to an Australian prisoner named Graham Maddux, a man who was accidentally duplicated during a temporal experiment and lived 2 completely separate lives in 2 different eras until time itself finally caught up with its mistake. The experiment took place in 1986 at Pine Gap, a highly classified joint US-Australian facility in the remote Australian outback. Officially, Pine Gap is a satellite tracking station. Unofficially, researchers claim it has been the site of some of the most advanced temporal research ever conducted. In 1986, scientists there were testing a new theory about temporal displacement, attempting to send a human subject backward through time by just a few decades. They needed someone whose psychological profile suggested high temporal resilience, someone intelligent but unstable, someone whose disappearance could be easily explained. Graham Maddux fit the criteria perfectly. Maddux was serving a lengthy sentence for fraud. He was brilliant, manipulative, and had no close family who would ask difficult questions. He was brought to Pine Gap under the pretense of participating in a classified psychological study. In reality, he was about to become the subject of an experiment that would shatter everything we think we know about the nature of existence. The procedure began normally enough. Maddox was placed in a displacement chamber, surrounded by experimental equipment designed to fold space-time around his body. But during the activation sequence, something malfunctioned. The equipment overloaded, energy readings spiked far beyond expected levels, and the chamber filled with blinding light. When researchers regained control, they found Maddox unconscious on the floor. His vital signs were stable, and he appeared physically unharmed. They assumed the experiment had failed completely. Maddox was returned to prison and eventually released in 1991. He went on to live a full life, married, had children, and grew old like any ordinary man. But what no one realized was that the experiment hadn't failed at all. It had worked too well. At the exact moment of the malfunction, a perfect duplicate of Graham Maddox had materialized in Perth, Australia, in the year 1954. The duplicate was confused but adaptable. Finding himself in an unfamiliar time with no explanation, he did what any intelligent survivor would do. He created a new identity. He called himself Jeffrey Collins, built a career as a businessman, married a woman he loved, and raised children who adored him. For decades, Jeffrey Collins lived a completely separate life from Graham Maddox, never knowing that another version of himself was experiencing a parallel existence in the same country, just displaced by 32 years. In 2011, Graham Maddox was 67 years old when he attended the funeral of a man named Jeffrey Collins. He had never met Collins, but a mutual acquaintance had invited him. When Maddox walked into the viewing room and looked into the open casket, his heart nearly stopped. The face staring back at him was his own. The same distinctive scars marked the same locations. The same unusual birthmarks appeared in the same patterns. Even the dental work was identical. Maddox demanded answers, and what followed shattered his sanity. DNA testing confirmed the impossible. Jeffrey Collins was a perfect genetic match to Graham Maddox. Not a relative, not a twin, but the exact same person. Collins's children showed no biological relation to their mother, despite the fact that she had given birth to them. It was as if reality itself had been forced to accommodate an existence that should never have been. Maddox suffered a complete mental breakdown. In his final years, he claimed that memories from both lives were flooding his consciousness. Decades of experiences that belonged to a man he had never met, yet somehow always was. He died in 2015, whispering about living two lives that never should have existed. Graham Maddox lived one life. Jeffrey Collins lived another. But they were the same man, and when time finally noticed its mistake, both had to pay the price. Number 3, the causality prisoner. This case is terrifying not because of what happened to the test subject, but because of what it suggests about the nature of the future itself. Imagine being sent 30 years forward in time. You witness catastrophic events that will reshape the entire world. You see cities destroyed, millions dead, a nation torn apart. And when you return and describe what you saw, the people in power actually listen. They make changes based on your warnings. And then, when the future finally arrives, everything you predicted never happens. Not because you were wrong, but because you erased that future simply by speaking about it. That is allegedly what happened to a Chinese prisoner named Lin Bowen in 1991, a man who saw the end of his country and then accidentally prevented it. The experiment took place in a classified facility in Xinjiang, China, part of a program codenamed Shijian Li, which translates to time fracture. The Chinese government had been conducting temporal research for decades, but by 1991, their scientists believed they were finally ready to attempt something unprecedented. They wanted to send a human subject 30 years into the future to observe China's position on the world stage. They needed someone intelligent enough to gather useful information, but expendable enough that his loss wouldn't matter. Lin Bowen was perfect. Lin was a political prisoner, a physicist who had spoken too freely about government policies, and found himself rotting in a cell for crimes of thought. His brilliant mind made him valuable as an observer. His status as an enemy of the state meant no one would mourn him if he never returned. He was brought to the facility, told exactly what was expected of him, and placed inside the temporal displacement chamber. The machine activated, and Lin Bowen vanished. He was gone for 2.1 seconds in real time. But when he reappeared, he was trembling with horror. Lin described a future that shocked everyone who heard it. He spoke of a massive earthquake that would strike Beijing in 2008, an earthquake of such devastating magnitude that it would level government buildings, destroy infrastructure, and kill millions. He described the chaos that followed: regional governments breaking away, civil war erupting across the country, international forces intervening in the power vacuum. By 2021, he said, China as a unified nation would cease to exist. The country would be fractured into competing territories, its global influence destroyed, its people scattered and suffering. At first, officials dismissed his account as temporal psychosis, the ramblings of a damaged mind. But Lin didn't just speak in generalities. He drew detailed maps of destruction. He provided specific dates, specific magnitudes, specific casualty figures. He named future leaders who would rise in the chaos and described their strategies with precision no one could explain. His information was too detailed, too coherent, too specific to ignore. High-ranking officials quietly began making changes. Construction plans for government buildings were redesigned with unprecedented seismic reinforcement. Emergency infrastructure programs were expanded across the country. Resources were redirected to earthquake preparedness on a massive scale. Then 2008 arrived. An earthquake did strike China that year, devastating the Sichuan province, killing tens of thousands. But Beijing remained untouched. The government buildings Lin had described crumbling stood firm. The catastrophic chain of events he had witnessed never began. When officials questioned Lin again, asking if this was what he had seen, he broke down weeping. He said everything was different. The future he had witnessed no longer existed. By acting on the information he brought back, the government had fundamentally altered the timeline. They had prevented the very catastrophe he had been sent to observe. The implications were staggering and deeply unsettling. The future was not fixed. Simply observing it and reporting what you saw could be enough to change it completely. Lin Bowen's knowledge had erased an entire timeline from existence. Billions of experiences, countless lives, an entire version of reality wiped away because one man described what he saw. The government apparently found this power too dangerous to leave in human hands. Lin Bowen was executed in 2010. All records of the experiment were classified at the highest level, and when 2021 arrived, China remained unified, exactly as Lin's warning had ensured. He saw one future and erased it just by speaking about it, which raises a haunting question. How many other futures have been destroyed by travelers who simply told someone what they witnessed? Number 2, the relic prisoner. This case is deeply unsettling because it suggests that the future might not just be observable, it might be inevitable. Imagine being sent nearly 150 years forward in time. You're only gone for less than a second, but when you return, you're clutching something in your hand. An object that shouldn't exist, a device containing information so impossible that it changes everything you thought you knew about fate, free will, and the nature of death itself. Now imagine looking through that device and finding your own name, your own death date, and the exact cause of your end. That is allegedly what happened to a Brazilian prisoner named Carlos Medeiros in 2003, a man who brought back proof of the future and discovered that knowing your fate doesn't mean you can escape it. The experiment took place in a secret laboratory constructed beneath a Brazilian military prison, part of a program codenamed Projeto Horizonte, which translates to Project Horizon. Brazilian scientists had been working for years on temporal displacement technology, using modified particle accelerators to attempt what they called temporal aperture creation. By 2003, they believed they were ready to send a human subject further into the future than anyone had ever traveled before. Their target was the year 2147. Their test subject was a man who had already lost everything. Carlos Medeiros was a former military intelligence officer convicted of treason. He had been a decorated soldier, a trusted operative, a man with access to the highest levels of classified information. His fall from grace had been absolute. Now he sat in a concrete cell with nothing but time stretching endlessly ahead of him. When officials approached him with an offer to participate in a groundbreaking experiment, he agreed without hesitation. What did he have left to lose? He was about to discover that the answer was far more terrifying than he imagined. The displacement lasted exactly 0.8 seconds in real time. Carlos vanished from the chamber in a flash of blinding energy and reappeared almost instantaneously. But when he materialized, he was clutching something in his right hand, a small metallic cube, perfectly smooth, with no visible seams, warm to the touch as if it contained some internal power source. He was pale, shaking, his eyes wide with an expression the researchers later described as absolute terror. He refused to let go of the cube, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For days, technicians attempted to open or analyze the object without success. Every tool they used was deflected by its seamless surface. Then, without warning, the cube activated on its own. A holographic interface projected from its surface, displaying text in Portuguese that was grammatically evolved, using syntax and vocabulary that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. What the researchers discovered inside the cube's database stopped their hearts. It contained names, dates, and causes of death. Millions of entries, a comprehensive record of human mortality stretching decades into the future. The researchers found their own names. They found their death dates. They found the specific circumstances of their ends. Carlos searched the database for himself. What he found made him collapse to his knees. The entry read, Medeiros, Carlos, death, March 17, 2003. Cause, temporal paradox resolution. The date of the experiment was March 15, 2003. According to the device, Carlos had 2 days left to live. The facility immediately went into lockdown. Government officials demanded the cube be destroyed, arguing that its very existence was too dangerous to allow. But before any action could be taken, March 17th arrived. That morning, guards found Carlos Medeiros dead in his cell. There were no marks on his body, no signs of struggle or illness. His heart had simply stopped, as if switched off by an invisible hand. The moment he died, the cube deactivated permanently, its surface going dark and cold. Over the following years, 3 researchers who had viewed their own death entries died on exactly the dates specified, from exactly the causes described. 2 researchers who had deliberately avoided looking at their entries remain alive to this day. Carlos brought back proof that the future already exists, fixed and immutable. The problem is, the future knew he would bring it back, and it made absolutely certain he couldn't change what was already written. Number 1, the infinite loop prisoner. This is the most disturbing case we've covered, and honestly, it might be the most terrifying time travel story ever recorded. Imagine being sent 1,000 years into the future. You expect to see wonders, marvels, the pinnacle of human achievement. But instead, you discover something horrifying. Time itself has become a prison. Humanity is trapped in an endless cycle, living the same 1,000 years over and over again for eternity. And you, the traveler, have experienced that loop more times than you can count. You've watched yourself die. You've watched yourself be born again. You've lived so long that the concept of death has lost all meaning. That is allegedly what happened to a death row inmate named Michael Torres in 2019, a man who claims he lived for over 10,000 years and returned with a warning that humanity refused to hear. The experiment took place at a black site facility buried deep in the Nevada desert. By 2019, temporal displacement technology had allegedly advanced far beyond anything previously attempted. Scientists had successfully sent subjects forward by decades. Now they wanted to push the boundaries to their absolute limit. They wanted to send someone 1,000 years into the future, to the year 3000. They needed a subject with nothing to lose, someone whose death was already scheduled, someone who wouldn't be missed. Michael Torres was a convicted serial killer awaiting execution. He volunteered without hesitation. Torres entered the displacement chamber on a cold November night. The machine hummed with more power than any previous experiment had required. Researchers monitored readings that pushed every instrument to its limits. Torres vanished in a blinding flash of light. He was gone for exactly 4.2 seconds in real time. But when he reappeared, the man standing before them was utterly transformed. His hair had turned completely white. His body was covered in scars that hadn't existed before. His eyes held an expression that made several researchers step backward in fear. It wasn't madness, it was something far worse. It was exhaustion so profound that it seemed to transcend human experience. Torres didn't speak for 3 days. He simply sat in his cell, staring at the walls, occasionally weeping without making a sound. When he finally began talking, his first words chilled everyone who heard them. He said that he had watched the sun die so many times, he lost count. He described reaching the year 3000 and finding humanity transformed. They had achieved near immortality. Disease was eradicated, death was optional. But they had also achieved something else: complete mastery over time itself. And that mastery had doomed them. Torres explained that at some point after the year 3000, someone had traveled backward to prevent a catastrophe. But the fix created something unexpected: a loop. From that point forward, time began repeating. The same 1,000 years played out over and over again. The year 3000 would end, and suddenly it was the year 2000 again. Everyone retained their memories. Everyone knew what was coming, and there was no escape. Torres said he lived through the loop more than 10 times, possibly more. He lost count somewhere around the 7th cycle. He described meeting other versions of himself from previous iterations. He described watching himself die from old age, only to wake up again at the beginning of the loop in a younger body. He described civilizations that embraced the cycle and civilizations that went mad trying to break it. Nothing worked. Time had become a closed circle. The most disturbing part of his account was what he said next. He claimed that one of his future selves had deliberately arranged for him to be sent back to 2019. The loop had been searching for a way to prevent its own creation, sending messages backward through time, trying to warn earlier humanity. Torres was one of those messages. His warning was simple and terrifying: don't build the machine. He refused to specify which machine or when it would be built. He said knowing too much would only accelerate the inevitable. Torres died 3 weeks after his return, his body finally surrendering to experiences no human was meant to endure. But his final words to the attending researcher still echo through classified reports. He whispered that he would see her again in the loop, and development of temporal technology continues worldwide to this day. 10 experiments, 10 prisoners, and 10 warnings we refuse to hear. Governments continue developing temporal technology in secret, convinced they can control what cannot be controlled. But every single case ends the same way, with destruction, death, or something worse. Maybe time isn't meant to be broken. Maybe the universe has rules we aren't supposed to bend. Or maybe, just maybe, we've already created the loop and we just don't know it yet.